Chapter 2. The glen was now dappled with the early afternoon sunlight, and the remains of their picnic lay spread out on the blanket in the center. The princess sat on one corner with a lap full of flowers, carefully weaving them into a wreath as she named each of them off with their properties and meanings. The governess looked on from where she sat nibbling the berries the youngest had brought her. It had been a successful outing. The high prince was beside her, comparing a small twig of leaves with the ones in the book they had brought, trying to identify the tree they had come from. "Is this it? The hawthorn?" he asked. She glanced over. "Aye, very good, your highness. Now, what is it good for?" He read through the page. "It says it's called the bread and cheese tree, 'cause you can eat the leaves, and it's just like eating a plate of bread and cheese. It keeps you from being hungry," he read, a little surprised. "Good in a pinch. You can make tea from the leaves for tummy troubles, too. And the flowers are quite tasty in salads. You can cook with the leaves. The berries are good for the blood. All in all, a good tree to find when you're lost in the woods," he concluded. "You can eat everything but the wood." She nodded. "Aye, 'tis a good hardwood, that, if it is inclined to carving you be." He laughed. "Maybe. Does the wood smoke a lot?" She smiled, admiring where his mind went. "Why don't you look in the book and see?" She leaned her head back against the tree, closing her eyes for a brief moment in the shifting glints from the overhead sun. She opened them quickly when the glittering shafts of light suddenly stopped piercing through her closed lids. She scanned the sky through the thin canopy and thought a cloud had passed overhead. Then she saw the shape of the cloud, and that it was not alone. She was on her feet in an instant, her eyes locating each of the three children without a thought. The princess was aware there was danger, but not in a panic. The eldest prince was beside her, dropping both book and hawthorn twig, and drawing a stick he had shaped for an earlier sword fight with his brother. But the youngest was well out of her reach, about 100 yards downstream by the river, chasing a small boat his brother had made him. What was worse, he was being stalked. Without tearing her eyes from his brother, the governess addressed the eldest prince, her accent slipping from her soft lilt into a clipped, no-nonsense one that told him he was to obey without question. "Lion, change yourself and your sister and get into the trees. Hide yourselves. Head back to the castle once I've drawn them off. Do not fly." With that, she ran for the river and the unsuspecting princeling. The creature creeping up on the child could only be described as a thing. Unlike the macaw in the sky above them, which were hideous mockeries of griffins, it had no wings. Its forebody was vaguely cat-like, maybe a tiger, but dark of fur. Its back legs were more insect and had an extra set of talons sticking out and up from its main body for snatching and carrying. Its head was vaguely serpentine and slightly equine, with sunken eyes and long fangs. It saw her just a little too late, putting on a burst of speed that brought it to the river steps behind her. She snatched the boy up and spun towards the river, tossing the little prince over the rushing water as if he were no more than a doll. "River, take him to safety," she commanded the torrent, as the creature swiped at her unprotected back in frustrated rage. It felt as if she had been set on fire, but she turned to face the creature, unarmed, watching the cold, yellow eyes as they swayed in front of her, trying to figure her out. She knew not to run. She had repeatedly told the children that unless something is chasing you, never run. It will only attract its attention. From the glen there came a shrill cry from Eagle, and the thing's head whipped around, interest peaked. Lion was bending over his sister, trying to draw her away when she had seen the attack on her brother, and screamed. The thing took a step in their direction, and the governess did the only thing she could. She ran. Its head swung her way, then back, uncertain which to choose. But there was only a squirrel with an acorn in its mouth on the blanket, and a large, juicy human doe running from it. It chose the doe. Commander Sky stood at the edge of the muster field, watching his troops training. Raw recruits, fresh from God knows where and God knows when, still trying to get used to altered bodies and increased strengths. A couple were still trying to adjust to the language and the concept of where they were. One, a newly eagle-eyed redhead, was complaining in rough Irish, a language less and less recruits came in speaking. "I was promised to ride home, sir. This isna home, and I've folk counting on me," he insisted. "Aye, you are," Sky responded, glancing at the small silver leaf gracing the shoulder of his chain shirt. "But you promised 10 years service in exchange, and now you'll serve." His soft Scottish burr stood in stark contrast to the brogues around him, affecting even the Irish he spoke. "But I meant after I had time to put me affairs in order. You were the dead dauber who followed some red-haired fanny into a wood. What she'd have done to you I've seen, and I've killed. You were rescued, and you accepted the price. Think on it this way. When you're done, you'll be better equipped to take care of those depending on you." The recruit opened his mouth again, but anything he said was drowned out by the horns. "What's that mean?" he managed in between the long blasts. Skye waited, counting until they were done. 3. "That means Makar," he ground. "What the hell are Makar?" the recruit stammered. "You'll find out soon enough, laddie buck," Skye snapped, then turned to the field and bellowed, "Ground troops to ballista and prepare to finish off the fallen flyers. Let's pluck us some wee crow." His men began to stream from the field, headed towards the ballistae on the far side to provide support for those manning the artillery, even as a flight of black, half-panther, half-crow things flew overhead. Bowman loosed arrows into the sky, and he started to run to join them, prepared to deal with the vicious creatures once they had been downed. Then he heard the scream from the woods. He hesitated a bare moment. Out of the corner of his eye he saw a small, laughing figure bobbing in the river that sped through the camp. The river tossed the figure out and into the arms of one of the washerwomen trying to gather in her laundry before fleeing. In a flash he saw that it was the young prince, and knew who was screaming in the woods, and that the attack here was merely a diversion. He drew a gleaming claymore from an unseen sheath at his back and turned from the field to run into the woods, away from the ballista and the main fight. The last 3 of his men, the higher ranks whose responsibility it was to see to the raw recruits, saw their commander heading away from the fight. They looked at each other, and in unspoken agreement, the leanest and fastest of them darted off after the men to report and send further assistance, while the other 2 fled after their commander, trusting his instincts to the fullest. She ran faster than she ever had in her life, deliberately not keeping to a straight path, dashing through narrow gaps in the trees. She was trying not to follow the river, but just when she thought she was well away, she would hear it again. She swerved behind a deadfall, away from the sound of water. Feeling her skirts tear through branches, she spared a glance back. It was closer than she had thought, and it hissed and spat at her, spraying her face with some acidic poison. She screamed as her eyes burned away in her sockets, and the creature bowled past her. She hit the ground, rolled over, and tried to press her back against something, anything, to give herself a chance. Her hands found a tree, and she pressed herself as far into it as she could, hoping beyond hope that it was a dryad tree, and she would be snatched to safety within the trunk. But it was not. She felt only a single white-hot claw rake her leg as she scrambled, and then it withdrew. There was something or someone in front of her, between them, something large and armed. No longer needing to fend off her attacker, she clawed at her face, trying to pull off the gooey substance that felt like it was melting her eyes. The smell of blood filled her senses, flavored by the vomitous stench on her face and now her hands. She could hear steel singing through the air and the slicing of flesh. Her rescuer made no grunts of pain or discomfort, even when she was sure the thing had to have clawed him. He gave only a growling shout that served for a battle cry, causing the thing to lurch backward and hiss. She remembered that sound, cried out a warning, "Spit's poison!" And just in time from the sound of it, there was a shifting of feet and then a hissing off to the right, with the rising stench of leaves beginning to dissolve. There were more sounds of sword cleaving flesh and the paring off of chitinous carapace. Then the creature was the one screaming, as it fell to the earth with a heavy thud and lay still. Her defender knelt beside her, a large but gentle hand on her arm, the other firmly on her thigh to staunch the bleeding. His words were soothing, the voice a deep, warm baritone. "'Tis gone, mum. No more trouble to you." Others approached in a hurry, clanging in armor, and she guessed where they had come from. "The prince," she gasped. "The wee royal bairn's as safe as houses," he said. "Right now we have to attend your own." She grabbed his arm, her fingers locked on the band of iron that was his bicep. "The other 2, they're... Glenn, Look for a squirrel. Don't forget the acorn. She had been holding on for word of her charges. That done, the world slipped from her grasp, and she mercifully fainted dead away. The world remained dark as everything else swam into focus. She was aware she was lying on a cot of rough linen, covered by a sheet and in fresh clothes. The pain in her back and leg had eased off and were now only a dull throb of fading ache, a memory of pain. Even her face held only the ghost of a burn. She brought her hand to her cheek, felt only smooth flesh when she had expected a melted mess, but she also felt a bandage over her eyes. There were voices on the other side of a canvas wall, and she surmised she was in a tent. One of them was a deep bass, familiar and comforting, though it was angry and frustrated. The other was lighter, feminine, afraid and concerned.
"The damage,"
came the deeper voice, the king's.
"I've healed the body the best I can. There will not even be a scar, but the eyes, they melted away. There's nothing to repair. Is there any..."
The voices drifted out again as the information sank into her brain. Blind. Her eyes were gone. How would she teach? How would she protect? She was now a burden on everyone she knew. She heard snips of other words drifting through her mind without context.
"Boom. Not her job, and yet that harridan will pay for this. It's for the best. I can't risk compensate her, one way or another."
And then his presence filled the tent, a mild, spicy warmth that soothed her more than any drug. Her first question was, as always, "The children?"
"Safe and worried about you."
"The attack?"
"Is over. They are finishing the last of it now."
She sighed at that and seemed to sink into herself. His hand, large and cool, and yet beautiful in a masculine way, slipped into hers and pressed gently.
"What you did, I cannot repay."
The sound of his voice told her, even if she had not known him as she had, how much that weighed upon him.
"The best I can do is grant you a boon. Anything your heart desires within my command."
"My eyes?" she said softly. He took a deep breath.
"That I cannot give."
Her decision was simple then. "I do not wish to be a burden to my king. Send me home."
"Your home is not what it was,"
he warned. There was something in his voice she had not the skill or experience to unravel.
"Time passes, and there was not much to hold you there, if you still remember."
I do. Mostly. And I know. I've met others more recent to your service, my king. But I'll manage somehow. I canna watch them any longer, or protect them, or read to learn new things to teach them. Though after a century and a half I'm running out of things to teach them, she added with a rueful chuckle. I love them, sire. I love you. I love this place and will always consider it home, but I'll not be a burden to you. I will take my chances, and if life is hard out there, it was not always easy here. I regret nothing but that I can no longer serve. We both know they will seek me out if I remain here, and that will not serve them well." She felt what she hoped was only a tear trickle from beneath the bandage. She felt his other hand reach up and brush it away. His voice was serious and deeply moved when he spoke again.
"Again, you serve my house beyond what is asked. I did not choose poorly, and I will..."
She knew he would not truly mourn her leaving. She was only mortal, and it was not in him to miss her long. She was grateful that he did not lie to her, though he had tried. And she was grateful for that, too. The children were another matter, and they both knew that. "May I tell them?"
"I will make the arrangements."
"I want to..." She stopped herself. One did not thank the Tuatha De Danann. "My life was good." She did not need to see his face to know there was a smile. She could feel it in his hand. When he took it from hers, it felt cold and empty. But such was the way of the Sidhe. One could not help but love them. As his presence left the tent, it was suddenly filled with the lively and unhappy voices of the children. The first thing she could coherently understand was the youngest's, "I should have brought Teddy." She sat up and pulled him onto her lap. "Nonsense. He would have had the stuffing torn out of him, and then who would guard your dreams?" He shook his head. "Teddy not guard dreams. Guard body while I dream." She smiled, fighting back tears. Still, he was not built to fight Fomor or Makar. He sighed and gave in, leaning his head against her. "It wasn't a Makar," the eldest said. "And I'm fairly certain not a Fomor either. I'm not sure what that was. The ones above, those were Makar. The general and her men made short, bloody work of them." His tone told her that he wished he had been with them on the field. She reached out for his hand and gave him a reassuring squeeze when he set it in hers. "You will be out there soon enough, I expect. It seems to me that should be the next step of your training. Something I could never have taught you." She had slipped into a more formal manner of speaking without a thought. He bowed over her hand, and she felt his forehead touch the back of it. The gesture moved her deeply. He had never done that before, to anyone that she knew of. "I will never forget what you have taught me," he said, in a tone that told her he understood what she was trying to tell him. He sounded older. She gave a dry laugh. "Best not. I spent near 2 centuries trying to teach it to you." She was rewarded with an answering chuckle. The princess's frown was evident in her voice. "How will I choose what to study with you gone?" The young prince's head came off her shoulder at that. "Simply find something you do not know and look it up in the library. Start from one end and work your way to the other. Read everything. Talk to the new people who come here. Find out what they know that you do not. Investigate. How do you think I kept up with you all these years? In a single year, you 3 exhausted what I knew in as many years as I had been alive when I came here. You're as prepared as I can make you." "You leaving?" the youngest growled. "No, you not allowed." His sister stepped in, even as the governess took a breath to answer. "We had her longer than father promised us. She was only supposed to be ours for a little while, until she taught us all she knew. Because she found a way around her own lack, we got to keep her longer than we should have. Got to be children longer than any other she. You can't complain." "Can to. Will to. Won't let go," he snapped stubbornly, crossing his arms. The governess and the princess both sighed, and she guessed the eldest had rolled his eyes. The young prince rarely had tantrums or demanded anything, but when he did, the world would bend first. Surprisingly, it was Lion who had the answer for this one. His voice was suddenly part his father's in the deepness of timbre and the words he chose, but the tone itself was the governess's own, the disapproval and disappointment that had worked so well for so long, especially with the little one. "Would you be unseelie, then, like her? To keep her prisoner to your will?" This stopped the young prince. "No, but I want—" "And what about what Nan wants?" the princess asked softly, using the child's name for the governess. Anne could feel the child turn his head to her. You want to leave?" She sighed. This was breaking her heart. "No, but I have to. You can't depend on me anymore." "Why not?" "I'm blind. I can't watch you or protect you or read to know what to teach you. I cannot check to see if you have things right." "Not blind." "What is blind?" Reluctantly, but realizing it was the only way to convince him, she unbound the bandage on her eyes. The princess gave a tiny gasp as things were clearly worse than she had expected. The eldest tightened his fist on something leathery at his hip and growled low. The youngest surprised her. He just looked, fingers in his mouth, as he thought. "That's not right. Should be something there." She smiled. "Even with something there, I could not see. The healer said there was nothing she could do, and if there was, she would know." "Shouldn't look scary. Should look nice," he insisted. "She shouldn't take that from you. Should be something there." His wet fingers danced lightly over her eyelids, and she could feel something cool begin to fill the empty sockets, give her eyelids something to cover and not sink into. She felt less uncomfortable. She gave him a kiss, neither knowing or caring what he had done. He sighed and curled up in her embrace again. Better, he mumbled. Not right, but something. From outside the tent, on the edges of the camp, there came a commotion that silenced everyone inside. She heard canvas move, but she paid it little mind. She strained her ears to hear what everyone else was shouting about. A few moments later, the flap opened again, and the prince said breathlessly, "A Makar landed under sign of truce. There's talk of a parley." "Will father—" the princess began. "No, the general is walking to the emissary now." He crossed to the bed. "Teacher, can you walk? I think this is something you will want to be hearing. We all will." "I agree," the princess replied, taking her brother from the governess's lap in spite of his protests. The governess swung her legs off the side of the bed, testing them. Hand took her arms as the two eldest helped her to her feet. She took a few tentative steps forward, felt more confident about her ability to walk, and nodded. "If you lead, I can walk." Lion tenderly placed her right hand upon his shoulder and began to slowly walk out of the tent. Eagle held the flap open for them, then took the governess's elbow gently, holding her little brother's hand in the other. As they approached the command tent, they were stopped by a guard. "I am sorry, your highnesses, my lady, but the king does not want you foreseen. The emissary is coming. Get yourselves somewhere hidden." Lion turned left and led the little band around several tents. At first they seemed to go away from their original destination, but after getting her thoroughly turned around and lost, they came up behind the royal pavilion just in time for the audience with the Makar and what was apparently its rider. The king's voice filled the air as the four of them crouched behind the wall where a throne had been set up.
"How dare you come here after what you and your men just tried?"
The emissary's voice was feminine and mocking, a little bird-like herself. "You cannot blame her for trying."
"Yes, I can."
The words were cold. Pressed against the governess's legs, the young prince suddenly jumped, turned, then threw his arms around something shorter than he with a whispered exclamation of, "Teddy!" The bear returned the embrace and quietly shushed him. Sky stood at attention just off to the left of the throne beside his general. He knew why he was here. True, the king was surrounded by his own personal guard, but he and a handful of his own men were an added buffer. The king's guard was trained to fight men and assassins, not Makar, and this one filled the pavilion with its foul stench. Its raven front end strutted forward with unwarranted pride as its panther tail lashed against its sleek, black-furred hindquarters, transmitting its irritation. 2 griffins and a pair of hippogriffs formed a rough gauntlet in the room, with the griffins closest to the throne and the few courtiers and the allowed soldiers gathered behind them. The Makar seemed a little itchy about it, but its rider was completely unfazed. There was something too cocky in her smile. "She offers you a deal. A duel, actually," she said. The dark hair that fell just past her shoulders had this slicked-back look of feathers instead of hair, but that might have been a trick of the light. Sky kept his eye on her and her posture, her hands especially, looking for any hint of a signal from her to her mount. That in and of itself was unusual. He had never seen one with a rider in all the years he had fought them.
"For what?" the king asked.
"The children. Get this over—"
"Never. She is a fool to ask."
"One of them," she countered. Her body language said she could care less either way.
"None. You have overstayed your welcome."
Even Sky knew the colder that voice got, the more likely there was to be bloodshed. And when their king was angered, all the griffins in the realm tended to be a little unruly. Something in the messenger's body caught his attention. This was what she was truly after, her real target. The first request had been meant to make the real one seem reasonable. "Fine. Your finest against our finest. Winner takes the loser." He felt a stream of ice water run down his spine as the rider looked in his direction when she said that. Even his general noticed this.
"And why would I be fool enough to run this risk? What would I want with one of her poisoned minions?" the king demanded.
The emissary sighed. She had apparently been prepared for this eventuality, but ordered to it as a last resort. "We'll cease all attacks on your borders for 3 moons.
"You will cease all attempts on my children forever."
She actually laughed at that. "The borders for a year and a day."
"Leave us. You will be summoned when we have decided."
That quickly the Makaran was dismissed and the subject open for discussion. The action surprised Sky and seemed to have taken the woman unprepared as well. The rider turned to her mount and led him outside, followed by 5 soldiers. Not a word was spoken until the 5th soldier returned, bowing to the king, and took up sentry just inside the tent flaps, which closed behind him. Assured the enemy was out of earshot, the king turned to his 3 generals who came to stand before the throne.
There is something going on here I do not see. Explain who can. This is not like the pitch.
Skye's general, the commander of ground forces, spoke. I think I understand, sire. She made a play for the children, yes. And the Makaran is right, she had to try. But I don't think she cared that she failed this time. I don't think they were the targets. She's trying to weaken your forces.
But why risk a cessation of hostilities or losing her own best man?
Asked the flight general, a russet griffin, his beak making the words somewhat clipped. The other general, a willowy she with a bow at his back who was in charge of the ballista, spoke in an almost tired voice, as if stating the obvious. If she wins, she gains one of our best and weakens us. If she loses, she doesn't really lose. She has to stop attacking for a year and a day. How perfect. She can build and reinforce her army without being molested. She loses her best soldier? So what? You really think he won't still be working for her, even if he takes oaths to us? His very presence will demoralize our men and weaken their ability to concentrate, fearing betrayal at every turn.
Won't she fear that of our men?
The griffin asked. Skye's general shook her head. Nay. Sire, we have in your infantry a man who has never been defeated. Men have fallen all around him, men we've been able to resurrect, to remake, to fight again. He has never had to be remade. I chose him well and for good reason. It is this man she wants. If she loses, all the things Archer said are true. If she wins, she knows he's our best and shall expect him to be the man on the field. She'll cry foul if he is not. If she wins, his honor is such that he will fight for her to protect your honor. But our men will be reluctant to kill him, or they will feel so betrayed they'll be ineffective. It'll break the backbone of your infantry and your cavalry. Finally, the king spoke.
And why is this? Why does one man have this kind of influence over my own army?
She held his eyes. Because he's trained most of them. Skye's hands tightened on the hilt of the sword he held point down in front of him. He resisted the urge to look.
And why has this man not been brought to my attention before?
This was a question Skye wanted an answer to himself. At this, she lowered her head. Selfish reasons, sire. 1, you would have taken him up the ranks and out of the place he is most useful. 2, he is of my line. At this, Skye turned, the news in abject shock.
Explain,
the king demanded. She took a deep breath. Before the borders closed, before they stopped believing, I left for a time and took a mortal lover in Dunvegan. He is of that line and bears all the marks of my favour. I've watched him till he was ripe and brought him here. The moment he crossed over, the sword came to him, and I knew. I kept him for myself, sire, and I beg your forgiveness, but more importantly, I beg you to protect him. She knows, somehow, and how much it would vex me to know she has taken him for herself. The king was silent for a long moment. He looked Skye over briefly, surveyed those in the room, then turned to his other 2 generals.
Will we be served well by this respite?
The griffin and the archer conferred. Skye's ancestress did not even try to join. Finally, they brought their heads up.
If we win, the griffin began, it will serve us very well. If we lose, for all the reasons Tanya has said,
his wing waved to encompass Skye's general,
it will devastate us.
The king nodded and all eyes turned to him.
Then my decision is clear. It is a risk we shall have to take.
Tanya cried out. The bitch will find a way to cheat. You know she will.
However,
he said, cutting off any further protest,
we shall still manage, win or lose, to defeat her purpose. Commander Skye, before me,
he commanded. Skye obeyed, taking small comfort in the tinge of warmth that was returning to the king's voice. It was the warmth of silk, still cool, but not the hard frost it had been a breath ago. The griffin stepped back to make room, and Skye turned, standing in front of the griffin to kneel before the griffin king. My liege, he managed. his sword's hilt barely visible above his shoulder.
You have served me well, I am to understand.
The king looked to the collar of his hastily donned shirt to see no pin there, marking his contracted time. I'm pleased you feel so, sire, he intoned, being very careful with his words. The last time he had stood before the king thus had been the first time, fresh from training and in full plate. He felt decidedly underdressed now, in only his kilt and shirt with its tiny griffins embroidered at the hems. How might I continue to serve?
By leaving.
Again, Tanya made a sound of protest, quickly shut off as she realized what this meant.
He has undertaken no contract for a period of service,
the king said, looking at her.
Therefore, it would not be cheating to let him go. Though I wonder why that is.
He turned his great blue eyes on Skye, seeing in the man's own steely orbs the stamp of the beautiful she-general.
Were you offered a contract?
Skye raised his head a little, but not enough to meet the king's eyes. Nay, sire. She came to me and said she needed me. I went, he shrugged, still not sure why. But there you go. Never asked for how long. I'm good at what I do and I like it. Not much opportunity for the sword back home. The king nodded, as if this explained something or satisfied him somehow.
I have a last mission for you. He turned to the nearest page. Fetch the governess and the things I asked to be prepared.
The page bobbed and was gone. He turned back to Skye.
Commander, one of my vassals has been gravely injured and is in need of an escort back to the world of men. I need you to do more than just take her to the gate. I need her brought to safety on the far side. She is dear to me in mind and served us better than she knows. I'll not throw her to the wolves I know live on the far side without some protection.
The Lion Prince did not wait for the page to find them, but stood and guided his teacher around to the front of the pavilion and brought her in himself. She clung to his shoulder, uncertain of the situation. She heard the other three fall in behind her. It surprised her that she could feel the presence of the gathered court on either side of her, hear the difference between outside and the interior of the massive pavilion. She stopped when the prince did and removed her hand from his shoulder, felt him step away from her as she bowed deeply before her king. My liege, she said softly, feeling love and loyalty burning fiercely, threatening to overwhelm her. She steeled herself, understanding formality and too well trained not to remain controlled.
Rise, my faithful one,
the king said, his voice full of the warmth she had always known and loved, and which, for the first time, threatened to fill her eyes with tears.
You have served me and my children better than any of us expected. You risked your own life to guard theirs, taking wounds meant for them upon yourself. Though I deeply regret the need for such things, you have asked to return to your own world, even knowing it is no longer the world you knew. I respect this. Arrangements have been made. You will leave presently, but not alone. He turned. Commander Skye.
Skye turned from observing the slip of a girl to stand at full attention before the king.
This woman is my treasure. You will guard her with your own life and honor, and bring her from my kingdom unto the world of men, where you will see her to safety.
He waved his hand, and the page, trotting into the tent, brought a small rucksack, which he handed to Skye.
Take this in keeping for her until you reach your destination.
Skye bowed, accepting the pack and slinging its slight weight onto his back. At a nod from the king, the little party began to break up. Tanya crossed to Skye, began fussing with the lapels and, in general, behaving as far from the superior officer as he had come to know as possible. Be well. I didn't want to give you up so soon. You could have told me. Would it have changed anything? She asked in her musical voice. No way to ken. I'll keep an eye on you. The sword, he began, not wanting to give it up, knowing he probably could not take it with him. She shook her head. 'Tis yours till death, when it will return here to wait for its heir. I'll look after them, too. Take care of her, she warned. She is precious to him. And to them. She nodded towards the 3 children who had swarmed the governess. Even the teddy bear was hugging a leg. I will keep my charge, he said stiffly. I know my duty. It is all I know. Thanks to me, she said almost bitterly. But you'll find more than that out there. I know. You remind me of him, you know. my Dunvegan man. Not enough to mistake you. Too much in between for that. She smiled reassuringly when he looked worried. But you're like him, in breadth and eye, and manner. The children nearly smothered the governess. She felt her tears threaten her more strongly, but she held them back for their sakes. She whispered to each of them to remember what she taught them, not just the book things, but the life lessons too. I'll miss you sore, she promised. And who knows? Mayhap I'll be able to leave something for you near the forts, or at a mound on Bealton and Samhain. The eldest set his hand at her neck, already of a height to her, though she could not remember him being so tall. He stepped back with a regal grace, taking her hand in his, and bowed over it. Painfully, she felt his hand then slip from hers as he moved away. The princess rose on her toes and pressed her cheek to hers in a manner a bit older than her apparent 8 years, and whispered, I shall forget nothing, neither kindness nor debt. With that she stepped away, and the governess felt another pang of regret and loss, and filled with pride and guilt as she realized that one of the gentry had just admitted to being in her debt. The youngest clung to her, his face buried in her skirts, crying silent and stubborn tears. She bent to hug him. You must be brave, my little prince, she said softly. I cannot stay, and you cannot come. I have given you all you need. Make me proud? He lifted his head, sniffling, but could only bring himself to nod. She tenderly kissed his forehead. She felt a tug at her other side and turned to the armored teddy bear, who took her hand in one paw and placed it on his right, helped her to feel him raise it to his forehead and salute. Smiling, she returned it. Then suddenly Teddy was pulling the young prince off her skirts, and after a second he stopped resisting. She felt the king's presence before he spoke or touched her, the looming warmth and comforting smell of him. The Tuatha king of the griffins was not himself a griffin, but smelled a little like them, like fur and sunshine, and the fresh air beneath their wings. She felt his perfectly formed fingers touch her chin and turn her face to his, a rumble of pleasure in his voice.
I like those. Well done, my son.
She smiled, missing him already, heartbroken at being sent away from this paradise. But she had asked, and knew without a doubt that it was the right thing. May I return? She asked timidly. When... She couldn't say it. She could feel his smile.
Yes, daughter. Tir na Nog will be your final rest. You have earned it as few others have in recent years. But one last gift, and go with our blessing.
She waited patiently, wanting to defer, to say it wasn't necessary and not daring. He said nothing more, but placed a kiss upon her forehead that filled her with the warmth of the sun. His palms slid down her arms to her hands, and then set her right into the left of her escort. A nod to the commander, and she was led away, a stately procession. She could feel the eyes of the remaining court on her. She held her composure until they reached the edge of the pavilion, when she heard the young prince's complaint, I don't want to grow up, and Teddy's soft, rarely heard voice, But you have to. A single tear raced down her cheek. Sky saw the tear. In a strange burst of compassion, he felt for her and squeezed her hand. It seemed to have been enough as she wiped her cheek and, taking a deep breath, followed him out of the camp.